There was a time when the mere whisper of one name could send boardrooms into silence and presidents into panic. John D. Rockefeller. Not just the world's first billionaire, but the architect of a corporate empire so vast, so untouchable, it dominated the global oil market and rewrote the rules of capitalism itself. His company, Standard Oil, didn't just compete, it conquered, crushing rivals without mercy, buying out governments, controlling entire industries, and waging economic war with a smile. He made enemies out of titans like Andrew Carnegie and faced off with U.S. presidents like it was just another board meeting. But before the power, before the fear, before the fortune, there was a poor boy from a broken home, the son of a con artist, scraping through life in 1830s America. His rise from rags to unimaginable riches is a story of vision, discipline, and cold-blooded ambition. It's both inspiring and chilling, a real-life lesson in what happens when one man's hunger for success goes completely unchecked. So, let's rewind history and return to the moment a boy named John D. Rockefeller was born into nothing and decided to own everything. It's 1839, and in a tiny town clinging to survival, a boy named John D. Rockefeller is born into a family with barely $1 to their name. His father, known around town as Devil Bill, wasn't your average man. He was a smooth-talking con artist, a part-time hypnotist, bear trainer, and a full-time hustler, who vanished for weeks, then returned in fine carriages, throwing around gifts like confetti, while his children froze in tattered clothes inside a collapsing home. What young John didn't know then was that his father was living a secret double life under a false name, Dr. William Livingston, conning the sick with fake medicines and charming other women into secret marriages. With Bill constantly disappearing, John's mother turned to faith, hard work, and her oldest son for help. Even as a child, John labored on the farm, managed the family's scarce finances, and even started small hustles like raising turkeys from stolen eggs, just to turn a profit. But any hope for stability? Shattered. When John was 10, his father was accused of sexual assault, forcing the family to flee in disgrace. Instead of redemption, Bill doubled down, vanishing more often, starting a second family in secret, and leaving John to become the de facto head of the Rockefeller household. By the time they finally settled in Cleveland, John was 16, sharp as a tack, and burdened with the financial survival of his entire family. College was out of reach. So, with nothing but determination, he dropped out 2 months before graduation and began pounding the pavement, facing rejection after rejection, simply because of his age. But John didn't break. He never did. After 6 relentless weeks, a small firm gave him a shot, without even discussing his salary, and he never forgot it. Every year, for the rest of his life, John celebrated September 26th as Job Day, more sacred to him than his own birthday. His work ethic? Ferocious. He studied every invoice, watched every transaction, and even opened the office safe, just to feel what $4,000 looked like, holding it like a sacred relic. He began whispering to himself every morning, "I am bound to be rich." By the end of that first year, he earned a humble $50, but his dedication earned him a raise, enough to help support his family and break free from his father's chaotic grip. Even then, John gave 10% of his salary to charity, reflecting his deep moral code. But when a recession hit 2 years later, and the firm's co-founder quit, Rockefeller, still a teenager, took over as the lead accountant. Business was crumbling, revenues were falling. But John wasn't shaken. He'd been through worse. With cold, calculated confidence, he began laying plans, not just to survive, but to dominate. John D. Rockefeller was done working for others. The next chapter, he was ready to build an empire. By the time John Rockefeller was 18, he'd already earned a reputation in Cleveland as a sharp and dependable bookkeeper, wise beyond his years. That's when he crossed paths with Maurice Clark, a 28-year-old chemist who saw potential in young John. Clark had plans to launch a produce business and invited John to be his partner. With modest savings and relentless ambition, they launched Clark and Rockefeller, dealing in grain, meat, beans, and whatever else could be sold for a profit. It wasn't glamorous, exhausting road trips, long days chasing clients. But owning a business gave John a new kind of pride. Though quiet and reserved, people started calling him Mr. Rockefeller, even in his youth. His maturity, sharp suits, and steady gaze made older businessmen trust him instantly. As their client list grew, they faced a new hurdle: scaling. Their solution? Outfox the system. They publicly claimed they were investing $10,000, twice the real amount, just to make banks believe they were flush with cash. The bluff worked, loans poured in, and then the Civil War erupted. Business boomed. Northern cities like Cleveland became economic hotspots, and John, an anti-slavery Baptist, chose not to enlist, but instead paid $300 to send a substitute, even funding gear for other Union soldiers. His company's profits quadrupled as wartime inflation soared, earning them a staggering $17,000 in 1862, over $500,000 today. But Rockefeller wasn't interested in comfort. He was hunting for a bigger opportunity, and he found it in black gold. With whales being hunted to near extinction for lamp oil, a new discovery changed everything. Crude oil could be drilled from the ground and turned into kerosene. Enter Samuel Andrews, a local tinkerer who figured out how to refine oil using sulfuric acid, producing a cleaner, brighter burn. John and Maurice loaned him $4,000, treating it as a mere side project. But soon, the oil profits dwarfed their produce business. With little hesitation, they pivoted completely, abandoning groceries for oil barrels. At first, the move was terrifying. Oil prices swung wildly, from 10 cents to $14, thanks to boom and bust towns popping up across the Pennsylvania oil fields. Rockefeller, always the strategist, chose not to drill at all. He'd let others take the risk. He'd refine. Still, the chaos rattled Maurice. In 1865, overwhelmed by the instability, Clark wanted out. Rockefeller, steady as ever, bought him out for $72,500, a jaw-dropping sum at the time. It was a bold, all-in bet, and just as the ink dried, the universe answered. A massive new oil field was discovered, validating John's gamble and cementing his fate. Fresh off buying out his partner, and with a quiet house in Cleveland and a devoted wife who matched his discipline and faith, John D. Rockefeller was finally ready to turn oil into empire. He rebranded the firm as Standard Oil, expanded with a second refinery, and began shipping kerosene across the Atlantic. But even John knew, vision alone wouldn't be enough. So he brought in a man who shared his obsession with domination, Henry Flagler. If Rockefeller was calculating, Flagler was relentless, a man who treated business not as trade, but as total war. Together they forged a strategy not to compete, but to conquer. When new refineries flooded the market, saturating the industry with cheap kerosene, John and Henry didn't panic. They plotted. Their masterstroke? Striking secret deals with the nation's most powerful railroads, at a time when rail was the lifeblood of oil transport. When the Pennsylvania Railroad tried to wipe Cleveland off the map by pulling out entirely, dozens of refineries fled the city in fear. But Rockefeller didn't flinch. He turned the desperation of rival railroads, the Erie and New York Central, into leverage, cutting backroom deals for shipping rates so low it was practically theft. While others paid $2.40 per barrel, Standard Oil paid just $1.65 or less. These railroad rebates, kept hidden from competitors, let Standard undercut the entire market. And that's exactly what John did. He triggered a brutal price war, slashing prices so low, his rivals bled out trying to match him, knowing full well they couldn't afford to. As one after another collapsed, Rockefeller scooped up their operations and raised prices once more, stronger than before. It was cutthroat capitalism at its most extreme, and while John knew these tactics were ethically murky, no law existed to stop him. Not yet. Standard Oil's profits soared, but John saw a storm forming. The endless discovery of oil fields in Pennsylvania was creating a glut so massive, prices were crashing, industry-wide. Rockefeller feared that the entire oil market could implode. Even if he won the battle, he might lose the war. So, in true Rockefeller fashion, he didn't back down. He looked for a solution not just to stabilize his empire, but to control the entire industry itself. By 1872, oil prices had plummeted another 25%, and the industry teetered on the edge of collapse. But John D. Rockefeller wasn't about to let Standard Oil fall with it. Teaming up with former rival Tom Scott of the Pennsylvania Railroad, Rockefeller orchestrated one of the most cutthroat alliances in business history. Together, they birthed a covert empire under the innocent-sounding name South Improvement Company, a secret syndicate between the country's biggest railroads and select refiners, with Rockefeller sitting comfortably at the center. In exchange for routing all his oil through their lines, John secured massive 50% rebates on shipping. And even more sinister, he received kickbacks from competitors' shipments too, along with confidential intel on their every move. It was corporate espionage, disguised as progress. Rival refiners were unknowingly feeding the very beast that was devouring them. But then, the scheme leaked to the press. Public fury erupted. Riots broke out. Tracks were torn from the ground. Standard's shipments were dumped in protest. The backlash was so explosive, it forced the alliance to dissolve within just 2 months. But Rockefeller wasn't shaken. If he couldn't control the industry from the shadows, he'd do it in plain sight. And so began the Cleveland Massacre. Fueled by paranoia that Standard still had secret deals with railroads, 22 out of 26 refiners in Cleveland caved, selling their companies for pennies on the dollar. Rockefeller offered them 2 options: walk away forever or join him. Most chose to fall in line, bringing their talent, their technology, and their secrets with them. Standard modernized every facility it touched, slashing costs, dominating output, tightening its grip. But just as Rockefeller tightened that grip, disaster struck. Black Thursday, 1873. Banks collapsed. A 6-year depression followed. Oil prices crashed to mere cents per barrel. Yet, while others sank, Standard Oil thrived. Thanks to John's financial discipline, upgraded plants, and unshakable credit, he weathered the storm. Then, he struck. Seeing blood in the water, Rockefeller launched a nationwide buyout spree, snatching up struggling refineries from Pittsburgh to Philadelphia. Using every tactic, cornering the barrel market, monopolizing rail lines, jacking up his rivals' costs until they had no choice but to surrender. He even built a private pipeline empire, a network that slithered across the eastern U.S., cutting transportation costs and tightening his control. By the end of it all, Rockefeller wasn't just refining oil, he was refining power. Standard Oil had become a monstrous monopoly, stretching coast to coast. So vast, so untouchable, that newspapers dubbed it the octopus. But the empire was still expanding. And the enemies? They were still watching. At the height of his empire, Rockefeller found himself facing a dangerous new threat: not from a foreign rival, but from within, the railroads that had once powered his rise. When Standard Oil began weaving a web of pipelines across America's eastern corridor, the once mighty Pennsylvania Railroad, helmed by Tom Scott, realized its most valuable client was making it irrelevant. Desperate to strike back, Scott laid his own pipelines, and even worse, began building oil refineries, stepping directly into Rockefeller's territory. John saw this not as competition, but as war. He retaliated with brutal precision, canceling all Standard shipments on Scott's rail lines, undercutting oil prices to force competitors and their shipments off Pennsylvania rails, and convincing rival railroads to slash freight costs, bleeding Scott's business dry. The fallout? Catastrophic. Railroads began paying refiners to ship oil. Workers were laid off en masse, salaries slashed. And then came fire. In Pittsburgh, enraged workers torched Pennsylvania Railroad property, 500 freight cars, 120 locomotives, and 27 buildings. Engulfed in flames, turning Rockefeller's economic assault into one of the bloodiest labor uprisings in U.S. history. But as the smoke cleared, Standard Oil stood tall, and the once feared Pennsylvania Railroad was broken. Scott, desperate and humiliated, approached Rockefeller for a truce. Henry Flagler urged John to finish him off, but Rockefeller saw something more valuable than revenge: control. He offered the railroad salvation, 47% of Standard's traffic, dividing the rest among their rivals. In return, he demanded deep rebates, insider shipping data, and a cut of every barrel moved. This wasn't a deal, it was dominance. The railroads had no leverage. And John? He had all the cards. With it, he didn't just run oil. He owned the infrastructure, the logistics, the intelligence of an entire industry. By now, Standard controlled nearly 90% of U.S. refining. Cleveland, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, all his. Only a few free refineries in New York remained. As for Tom Scott, the defeat broke him. He suffered a stroke and died within a year. Watching all of this was Scott's former protege, Andrew Carnegie. Furious and grieving, Carnegie blamed Rockefeller for his mentor's death. And thus, the most legendary rivalry in American business was born: steel versus oil. But even as Rockefeller rose to infamy, with newspapers branding him a cold, calculating tyrant, the man himself lived a curious contradiction. He avoided the champagne-soaked parties of his peers, preferring quiet time with his children over Wall Street galas. He wore plain suits, spoke softly, and kept his empire tightly controlled from behind closed doors. Because just as Standard Oil hit its peak, two seismic threats emerged. Edison's new electric light bulb, promising to replace kerosene altogether, and a massive oil reserve discovered in northern Ohio, threatening a supply glut that could crash prices overnight. As panic spread across Standard's boardrooms, Rockefeller remained perfectly still, while others saw a crisis. John D. Rockefeller saw his next great opportunity.